Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We are finishing up the first part of our short series. This is the Goddesses in Every Woman portion of the series. We're going to talk about gods in every man next, but this is the next installment, the final installment, talking about the goddess energies, the archetypes. This comes from a book called Goddesses in Every Woman, and this is a third podcast in a three-part of the goddesses, right? So if you want to hear all the way back, go back 2 episodes and listen to the last 2 episodes because it'll catch you up to where we are today if you're a brand new listener or if you haven't heard those episodes yet. This book, Goddesses in Every Woman, is written by Jean Shinoda Boleyn. She's a medical doctor and a Jungian analyst, and she wrote about all the archetypes based on the Greek pantheon of goddesses that show up in feminine energy. And we've been discussing these. In the first episode, we started to discuss the virgin goddesses of Artemis, Athena, and Hestia. And then the last episode, we talked about the vulnerable goddess archetypes of Demeter, Persephone, and Hera. And today, we're going to start talking about the final goddess archetype, and this is the alchemical goddess. There's only one goddess here, and this energy and archetype is the goddess of Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. Now, Aphrodite, much like the virgin goddesses, has this energy about her where she does what she wants to do. She's self-directed. She's not necessarily dependent on anybody else for her direction in life. She's very self-directed. And also, much like the vulnerable goddesses, she has relationships. She's in relationship with other people. She's a very sensual goddess, a very sexual goddess in a lot of ways. And so she has relationships and she's self-directed. It's almost like she's got qualities of both of the other categories of goddesses we've already talked about. And also, she doesn't have a lot of the downsides that they have, right? She's not so far over on the self-directed side that she loses relationship, but she's not so far on the vulnerable side that she's a sitting duck and can be exploited. She has a lot of coverage over the deficiencies of the other 2 category of goddesses or goddess archetypes seems to have brought to the forefront. So this is a really interesting goddess to talk about. And again, it's the alchemical goddess of Aphrodite.
Right, and that's why Boleyn calls her alchemical, because she takes some of the good qualities from both sides and then turns it into something completely new. And that's not to say that Aphrodite doesn't have, like, Aphrodite and Aphrodite archetypes don't have their weaknesses. They definitely do. And at the same time, it's kind of nice to be an Aphrodite or to identify or tap into Aphrodite energy. So as you mentioned, Aphrodite was the goddess of love and beauty. And she also, according to Homer, was a lover of laughter. So she was also like a happy, positive, joyful, pleasure-oriented, sensual goddess. She was the daughter of Zeus, and there's two different etymology stories for Aphrodite, which becomes sort of relevant when you're trying to break down this goddess to understand her as an archetype. One is that she simply is the daughter of Zeus and the sea nymph Dione, and so she was like the product of their relationship. And then the second is a much more sort of disembodied etymology tale, which is, you might be familiar with like Botticelli's Birth of Venus, where she's rising from the sea. I guess another thing that, a reverent way that people refer to the Botticelli picture or the painting is Venus on the half shell. And she's like rising up on a clamshell with like foam around her and hair strategically placed on her body. And according to that version, that etymology tale, it's that basically she was born by Kronos being the father of Zeus, cutting off his own father's, Uranus's, genitals and then throwing them into the ocean. And the combination of the sea foam and the semen ended up creating Aphrodite. And then she rose from the sea as a fully grown woman, kind of like Athena. So those are 2 very different etymology tales for Aphrodite. And I think what's fascinating about Aphrodite is that unlike the vulnerable goddesses, who didn't really get a choice in their relationships, we didn't talk about this, but Hera was actually seduced by Zeus. And even though she became a very loyal companion for him, it started out by her being sort of tricked by him. And then both Demeter was raped and Persephone was abducted. And so the vulnerable goddesses didn't really get a choice in who they were with. But Aphrodite did. She came as a fully grown woman and or as a woman had grown up. When she entered the pantheon of gods and goddesses, she got her pick of who she wanted. And because she was the goddess of beauty and she was so beautiful, many suitors came after her. But she chose Hephaestus, which is really kind of a fascinating choice because Hephaestus was the rejected son of Hera, the one who had a club foot. And so Aphrodite chose Hephaestus of all of the pantheon of gods to marry. Now, that didn't mean that she was loyal to him. But the concept is that it's a possibility that she chose Hephaestus because he was the god of the fire of the forge or the craftsman. And so there was this concept in Greek mythology that she may have coupled with him or married him in order to couple love and craftsmanship to create art. Some children came from her liaisons, most notably her child, Harmonia. I almost wanted to say Hermione. Harmonia, which is another word for harmony, which was the love child between her and Ares, the god of war, because there was this concept that the perfect balance between love and war is harmony, which is kind of a fascinating concept. And her other notable child was Hermaphrodite, who was the child of her liaison with Hermes. And Hermaphrodite is the combination of Hermes and Aphrodite. And Hermaphrodite was, you can either see it as an androgynous character or as a bisexual character, which came with the qualities of both parents. And so those are some of the notable liaisons. And she also had a lot of affairs with mortals. And her relationship and impact on mortals is really, I think, one of the most important things when breaking down this concept of what it means to be an Aphrodite archetype. Because sometimes she was quite harsh with mortals. That was usually when they didn't give her her due in worship or they thought they could be competitive in beauty. But she also was a catalyst for growth for a lot of them. She, particularly in the stories of like Psyche and Atalanta, in both of these, she encouraged them or actually pushed them further than they thought that they could go. And in that way became a sort of a catalyst for growth and development in both of them. So while with some mortals she was damaging, other mortals she was a catalyst for growth, which is really a very important in understanding the Aphrodite archetype. In modern, women, when you are, or even as an anima for a man, when you are tapped into the archetype or the Aphrodite archetype, this is when most notably you're falling in love. So kind of like the Demeter energy shows up during pregnancy or anytime you desire to have a child, or the Hera energy can show up when you are, or you're about to get married or on the day of your wedding, or the Athena energy shows up when maybe you're going out for a job, right? Or the Artemis energy shows up when you're being competitive. They all kind of pop up at different times. Well, Aphrodite shows up when you fall in love. Every time you fall in love and the person you love loves you back, you're in the Aphrodite time period.
I almost imagine like a Cupid type energy coming, right? Like the little Cupid with the bow and arrow shooting through the heart.
Yeah, actually, Cupid, in some elements of the Aphrodite story, Cupid predates Aphrodite, but in most of them, Cupid was actually her son. And so, yeah, Cupid comes from Aphrodite, like that falling in love, the being struck by an arrow. The moment when you have your hormones all carbonated and you just want to be with that person and you can't think of anything else. You're in an Aphrodite time period. Now, there are some women who are Aphrodite archetypes, and so they are more likely to fall in love on a regular basis. So falling in love with people and getting really charmed by them and getting crushes a lot. This is something that Aphrodite women do regardless of whether or not they have any interest in pursuing their crushes or their loves. They have a tendency to just kind of get charmed and fall in love with people over and over again. And usually most Aphrodite archetyped women are very charming themselves. And so they can create these moments of sort of falling in love with somebody else while being, while they fall in love with the Aphrodite archetyped woman as well. So like in a party situation where you really you connect with somebody and you have that one-on-one chemistry and you just love talking to them, and it kind of doesn't, it's not necessarily like it's not necessarily sexual, but it kind of is too. It's kind of like that when you go back to like the Enneagram subtypes, and there's those three instincts of self-preservation, social, and sexual, or what's called one-to-one. That sexual or one-to-one energy is very Aphrodite-like. So there's an element of it of deep emotional connection, even if it's momentary. And in fact, Aphrodite encourages sort of a momentary one-to-one or a sexual connection. And it doesn't necessarily have to be consummated in a physical way. The challenge with being an Aphrodite archetype all the time, though, is that Aphrodite hasn't always been welcome as a feminine archetype in a lot of different cultures. In fact, there are some cultures there it will get you literally killed now. There's been a lot of cultures in the past that have degraded the sensuality and the sexuality that naturally comes with Aphrodite. And so these are women who in the past may have been called like sluts or whores or slut shamed. And there are also women who may have gotten stoned, like literally killed for an affair they had, or just being the object of desire for somebody else who was married. And so being an Aphrodite at sometimes, certain times in the past or even certain places in the world is a dangerous thing. And also Aphrodite is the part of us that despite it being maybe socially unacceptable at certain time periods or certain places, it's the part of a woman that is drawn towards the sensual, the beautiful, love, and sexuality. So it's the part of you that awakens during orgasm. It's the part of you that wants to seek orgasm or to have consummated physical relationships in order to achieve that. In fact, Boleyn calls it transpersonal orgasm. So it's not just a taking of it, but it's also a simultaneous giving of it. So the Aphrodite energy is anytime a woman's body is awoken and wants to awaken their partner's body as well and have that mutual experience of sensuality and the high of the orgasmic release.
That can be in the physical expression and also translated to emotional and spiritual expression as well for Aphrodite. Right? It's not just limited to the physical orgasm of the creative act of sex itself, but it can also be the creativity of imagination and playfulness and all these spiritual or emotional essences as well.
Absolutely. It can be like the marriage of or the consummation of two inspired ideas that turn into a new creative concept or system. So it's anytime there's something that's like creative and inspired and passionate, but it shouldn't be marginalized how important Aphrodite is in the awakening of the physical and sexual experience for a woman. That is a very Aphrodite place for women, and she's pulling on the Aphrodite archetype when she awakens her body to that. So there is the physical intimacy element, the sexual expression of Aphrodite, the desire to have that be in a relationship, to give and to take, right? Because Aphrodite was alchemical. She wasn't vulnerable and she wasn't shut off. She was both awakened and giving. And so that's a very important element for the feminine archetype. But as you mentioned, it can go beyond just the physical or sexual experience. It can go into that concept of creative work, right? Because creative work is passion. It's passion, it's igniting, it's intense focus and energy going towards something that is going to create something new. So women who are awoken, or even men who have Aphrodite as their anima, they're awoken to creativity. They might be artists, or they might be scientists. They could be from all different walks of life or all different career choices, as long as they're trying to create something new. They're trying to, they throw themselves into a passion project. It makes me think of a Jim Carrey quote I heard a long time ago, which I've oftentimes used to express extroverted intuition or exploration as a cognitive function. Jim Carrey one time said, I feel sorry to anybody in a relationship with me when I'm making love to one of my ideas. That's a very Aphrodite sentence, because Aphrodite falls in love with people and falls in love with ideas. And so Aphrodite is present anytime that's happening. And it feels alchemical. It feels like you're turning lead to gold in those moments. It turns like you're making something precious that maybe came from nothing, really, to speak of.
What's interesting about the Aphrodite energy or archetype is just how much, again, that creativity, that sensuality and creativity, that fire that's inside, and the creativity of the orgasm, whether it's a literal or figurative orgasm experience for the feminine energy in that archetype, can often be a muse for others. In other words, this is an energy that could, I'm sure there's been famous artists and writers and creators in history who've had an Aphrodite energy in their life, who's been their muse. It's inspired them to create great art, whether they're female or male. That Aphrodite energy, either inside themselves or inside another person. Let's just talk about the other person. The Aphrodite can be a catalyst, a support structure for a lot of creativity to happen. I think that's just something that is very interesting about this archetype. I think in terms of a good example from popular media, the show Firefly that was out back in the early 2000s, the character on the show, Inara, who is a companion flying on the ship with the rest of the crew, was basically, she would have sexual experiences with both men and women. That was her career. And she would be a support in the sexual experience. She was almost a muse to the captain of the ship in some ways. I don't remember, did they have a sexual relationship or not in the show. I think it was implied that they always were sexually attracted to each other, but it never actually ended up becoming a thing that I can remember. But she was definitely a muse for a lot of people, and this kind of creative, sensual, sexual energy is there. And I think you could probably see this energy showing up in things very, zoomed way down at the physical level with maybe models, people, this energy of modeling or displaying the beauty of the feminine, form, maybe some sex work and things of this nature, but all the way up to more abstract terms. I think we could say maybe Oprah has a lot of Aphrodite energy in her, whereas it's not necessarily a direct sexual experience with her audience, but she is a muse for her audience in a lot of ways. She's a pilot light to get people excited about ideas, and she helps us fall in love with other people's ideas, and she helps us fall in love with concepts and even fall in love with ourselves and who we can become. And she's I think, a good example of a woman who's embodying this Aphrodite archetype. And instead of just holding it to herself and one of her partners, she's blasting it out to the world, and we're all able to benefit from that energy she brings. I think she's a really interesting example we could look at.
Yeah, she would be like what happens when an Aphrodite and an Athena are the two main archetypes in a woman. And so she's built an empire, and then she also is, like you mentioned, she's created like soil that other people can grow in. And you mentioned that it's kind of weird to all bring this back to the concept of orgasm, but I always keep thinking about that phrase transpersonal orgasm, which is basically both people get to have fulfillment. Both people get to have a fulfilled experience. And so you cross-pollinate that, that creativity, that life, that spark, that thing that makes, that really encourages people, like you mentioned, to do better. And that was the other thing that Aphrodite brought to the table is, as I mentioned, when she was engaging with mortals, she could be either destructive or she could be a catalyst for growth. Now, when she was destructive, you can see this when people fall in love and it's not reciprocal. And that can make people quite heartsick. You can also see it when people lose themselves to Aphrodite and they're not thinking, right? They're not being smart about their choices. And then they end up in a bad relationship, or they end up doing things they regret because they're so in the moment and they're so in the sensuality of it. And it can cause some real problems. So Aphrodite does also have a dark side, just like all of the goddesses have a dark side. And as a catalyst for growth, Aphrodite, for Psyche and Atalanta, put in front of them challenges that they themselves didn't think that they could overcome, and yet they did. And both of them were richly rewarded for that. So according to the stories of Aphrodite, Aphrodite is also a promoter of growth and development, which I find really fascinating. Now, there's not just one kind of Aphrodite. We think of Aphrodite as being beautiful. In fact, the most beautiful of all of the goddesses. And whenever anybody tried to compare her to anybody else, then the person that she was being compared to always suffered. That was the one thing that she didn't like, is when people said somebody else might be more beautiful than her. That was not okay.
Kind of like the queen in Snow White, who's the fairest in the land. And if somebody else was deemed that, she'd punish them.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very dark Aphrodite, sweet little Persephone, dynamic there. So now that we have all 7 of the goddesses under our belt, I can start referencing the other ones as relationships. But the thing about, let's see, where was I talking about? I was talking about Aphrodite having a dark side. And then, also that when she's a catalyst for growth, a couple of the characteristics she brings is that, first of all, she removes this concept of guilt and judgment from people enjoying themselves. A lot of other archetypes have very judgmental perspectives and judgmental attitudes. And it's not until you get to Aphrodite where there's a true openness. There's a true lack of judgment. she doesn't really judge what people do. She doesn't really care how people are spending their time. She's open and she's generous with her opinions, and she comes from a place of abundance because she's so abundant, right? She has so much love. She's the goddess of love, and love is an abundant resource. And so she perpetually gives it, and she just doesn't see any reason to judge anybody else's lifestyle or what they're doing either. And then on top of that, there's a charisma that comes with that. People like a lot of openness. They like it when they don't feel judged by somebody else. And since Aphrodite has that openness about her, and she has that ability to really connect one-to-one, even if it's momentary, like just a momentary, even, women who are, I guess the archaic term would be like a plain Jane. They're not necessarily the epitome of the beautiful Aphrodite themselves. They still have something about them. It's like an it quality. Aphrodite gives people an it quality, and even men that have Aphrodite as their anima. It's this charm about them that people can't quite put their finger on. And so, not all Aphrodites have people crossing rooms to come talk to them. But as you get closer to an Aphrodite, there's always something that catches you. There's like, that's a really intriguing character. So one of the things that developing an Aphrodite quality, if this is not your natural archetype, like in particular for people like Hestia who are looking for different personas and archetypes to really embody, Aphrodite is a nice one to start developing because it gives you sort of this openness and this charisma that has you become intriguing to others, and it causes more intrigue to in others. Or let's see, intrigue in others and for others. Transpersonal, again, it's a very transpersonal archetype, so it causes these relationships to get more emotionally deep and connected. For Artemises and Athenas, Aphrodite is a great one to tap into, because there's a tendency for Artemises and Athenas to get a little emotionally distant. And for Aphrodite, emotional distance, she doesn't necessarily want an emotional commitment, but she definitely wants intimacy.
So it's more of an immediacy then. That commitment is a long-term emotional bond, and Aphrodite is more interested in the intensity of the sensual connection than the longevity of the sensual connection. So I guess if that intensity could be sustained, it would have a longer timeline, right? But that intensity is hard to sustain for so long, and this is probably what causes the Aphrodite energy to flow from partner to partner. Often, it's because the intensity that Aphrodite craves is so high, it's almost impossible to sustain over the long term. And so this is something I think that comes out is, I don't know if I want to use the word promiscuous nature to Aphrodite. Maybe that's the wrong word, but definitely an oscillation through partners, or not oscillation, but a movement through a lot of partners over time, because it's a seeking of that just intense experience, right?
Yeah. If an Aphrodite archetyped woman, if this is her primary archetype and she wants to be in a long-term relationship, usually she has to start developing more Hera qualities. Hera is the goddess of marriage and commitment. And so an Aphrodite that develops Hera, that's actually a really nice relationship for their spouse, because they have the commitment of Hera, but then they have the spark of Aphrodite. So it keeps the relationship, intense and on fire.
Yeah.
And so that's a really good combination. But without the Hera quality of commitment, then an Aphrodite will have a tendency to kind of start having her eyes wander. And I think one of the nice things about having access to other goddesses too for an Aphrodite woman is that she might need to do more Demeter goddess energy as well if she has children. I actually struggle with this. I identify a lot with Aphrodite, even though I came from a very strict religious upbringing where Aphrodite qualities were pretty much like beaten out of me as early as humanly possible. And my older sister was very much an Aphrodite, and I saw all the struggle that she had with my parents and relationship, and in this conservative, a very religiously conservative upbringing. I watched how much struggle she had, and so I just kind of suppressed that part of who I was. And it wasn't until I became much older, like actually just recently after reading this book, it was a major aha that I'm like, I actually think that I have a lot of Aphrodite. And I channeled it into the idea generation aspect of me. I channeled it into creative ideas, and that was where I allowed my Aphrodite to show up. But now that I'm getting more open to it, I'm realizing that I have sort of an Aphrodite relationship with my daughter, in the sense that when I'm with her, I'm like super tuned in and very attached to her. And then when she's out of my eyesight, I don't think about her. So I've had to do a lot of Demeter development so that I like, oh yeah, I do have a kid, don't I? And unfortunately, Aphrodite women create this like almost what's the word, addiction from their children, because they give them inconsistent reward. And that's actually the way to create addiction in something, is to give it inconsistent reward. And so I was sort of creating that in my daughter unintentionally by giving such intense energetic focus at times, and then kind of being weirdly neglectful at other times. So Demeter comes in to save the day right now. I'm more consistent in my noticing of my child and pouring into her and nurturing her. And that's one of the things that Aphrodites have to watch for, is that when they're with you, they're with you. And then when they're not, they kind of forget that you're around. And so that's another dark side of Aphrodite.
I would say you mentioned this idea of Aphrodite energy in you that was maybe, suppressed in your religious upbringing. And that really brings up a good point, that the Aphrodite energy is extremely threatening to most people, like extremely threatening to women. If you're a woman and you have Aphrodite energy, you might be a massive threat to other women, because they're like, oh my goodness, she has a sensuality and a sexuality and an allure, an appeal to her, just energetically, independent of even how she looks, maybe an it factor. And what if the man I'm with, or what if the person I'm with, is super attracted, and I lose this relationship because this Aphrodite energy is around me? And so it puts other feminine energies, whether it's embodied by a man or a woman, on high alert against that energy, to say, this is dangerous ground that we're on, having this energy around. So let's marginalize it. Let's suppress it. Let's keep it at arm's length. Let's demonize it. Let's slut shame it. Whatever you have to do to keep this thing away from us, because it's so dangerous. And I think men also, the masculine energies can also fear, not just the women that are embodying feminine energies, but men that are embodying masculine energies can very much fear this, because of the inability for it to be controlled. The energy is very independent, much like the virgin goddesses, but it still wants relationships. So it's this weird, like, how does this energy, how is this contained? It can't be contained. It's a creative sexual force to be reckoned with. It can't really be contained. And so there's rules placed and suppression that happens, and marginalization and demonization. And it is an energy that I think is misunderstood and treated often in most cultures very hostile. And I think it's unfortunate, because I think there's a lot that we get from this energy, having it represented, that we don't get if we suppress it as culture. So I just want to make that comment. I think it's a threat to a lot of people.
Yeah, you can see it in like the Scarlet Letter.
Yeah.
What was her name? Was it Hester Prym? I can't remember her name. But if it was Hester, that's really interesting. But she I don't think it was Hestia. I think it was something else, but I can't remember her first name. Anyway, she was branded with the letter A on her clothing to let everybody know that here comes an Aphrodite. I mean, A stood for adulterer, but it might as well have stood for Aphrodite. And so then she had to get, sort of branded as being dangerous. And I think it's because Aphrodite energy is very powerful.
I think it's celebrated when it's at the top. Like, I think of like Cleopatra as probably Aphrodite energy, the Queen Cleopatra. Probably had a lot of these, maybe not fully Aphrodite. She probably had other qualities as well. But when I think of her, I think of a very sensual. And when you're a dominant role, like as a queen or a princess or something, you probably are allowed to express this in ways you wouldn't be able to if you were under the rule of others.
Or a lot of celebrities. I mean, we want our movie stars to all be Aphrodites, right? We want them all to be celebrated and beautiful and sexual and sensual. And so, yeah, it's okay to be an Aphrodite at the top, but until you get there, people are pretty threatened by the concept. In particular, the Heras. Heras don't usually like a lot of Aphrodite, so that's very threatening to them. And I can totally see why. And as somebody who also has a lot of Hera in me, right? I have quite a bit of Aphrodite, but lots of Hera. Then I can completely understand why that would be threatening to a committed relationship. Here's this thing that's temporary at best, that's coming through like wildfire. And that's actually the path of growth for Aphrodite, is to remember that there are long-term consequences to actions. Aphrodite tends to be very in the moment, and it's what pleases her. So that's what she follows. She follows what pleases her and what catches her eye. And so for an Aphrodite woman, the path of growth is to have much longer timelines in mind, consequences to actions, recognizing that you can hurt people along the way. Aphrodites very frequently leave a string of broken hearts behind them. And so when you are embodying this energy, if it's not something that has to be awoken, if this is your primary archetype, not just having the desire to connect emotionally, but also having some longevity there, maybe. And even if you end up moving on from a relationship, recognizing that other people don't get over things as quickly as you do. You probably get over things much quicker than they do. And so recognizing that it's not just your emotional experience and not just that transpersonal experience in the moment, but a longer timeline of a transpersonal experience. Leaving relationships better than when you got there, right? Leave the camp better than when you got there. And there's a final lesson that an Aphrodite archetype woman can learn through one of the stories of Aphrodite pushing someone else to excel. And that is the story of Psyche. And by the way, as we complete this portion of the series, I just want to once again recommend people read the book Goddesses in Every Woman. It was written in 1983. It's got some older references. All the people that she uses as examples of each of these archetypes are, they're 30-year-old references or later, right? They're references of things that were relevant in her day. And there are some elements that might feel almost like she's speaking to a different time, because she is. I mean, in the last 30-something years, there's been a lot of changes. But I do recommend grabbing the 30th edition, anniversary edition.
We'll have a link in the show notes right below the show.
Exactly. And go check this out, because I think even if it's an older book, it's still very powerful. And these archetypes are really, to me, there was a lot of eye-opening information. In particular, the empowering message of Artemis and Athena being feminine archetypes was a big eye-opener to me. And this idea that, I might be an Aphrodite. How have I been suppressing that for a long time? And what do I do to grow into that? And also, what do I need to do in order to become a better Demeter? And how do I connect with my Persephone, my inner girl, which I think I've lost a little bit of that, and I need to reconnect with that. And maybe I can do that with my daughter. So there was just a lot of ahas for me. But as we wrap up this portion on Aphrodite, I want to read a portion of one of the most powerful things an Aphrodite woman can do to develop and grow themselves is wrapped up in this story of Psyche. And Psyche is a pregnant mortal woman who seeks to be reunited with her husband Eros, god of love and Aphrodite's son. She realizes that she must submit herself to an angry and antagonistic Aphrodite if she is ever going to be reconciled with Eros. So she presents herself to the goddess, and to test her, Aphrodite gives her 4 tasks. The 4 tasks of Aphrodite have important symbolic meanings. Each one represents a capability that women need to develop. Each time Psyche masters a task, she acquires an ability she didn't have before, an ability equated in Jungian psychology with the animus or masculine aspects of a woman's personality. Although these abilities often feel masculine to women who, like Psyche, need to make an effort to develop them, there are natural attributes of Artemis and Athena women. So again, going back to the Artemis and Athena feminine archetypes, not masculine animus. As a mythological figure, Psyche is a lover like Aphrodite, a wife like Hera, and a pregnant mother like Demeter. Moreover, in the course of her myth, she also goes to the underworld and returns, and so resembles Persephone as well. Women who put relationships first and react instinctively or emotionally to others need to develop the abilities symbolized by each task. Only then can they assess their options and act decisively in their best interests. So Psyche is really interesting because she's actually in some ways embodying all of these archetypes. So the tasks put in front of her are really tasks or ways of developing that are good for all women, or those who are trying to balance out their feminine archetypes. So task number 1 was sorting the seeds. Aphrodite leads Psyche into a room and shows her an enormous pile of seeds jumbled together: corn, barley, millet, poppy, chickpeas, lentils, beans, etc. And tells her that she must sort each kind of seed or grain into its own pile before evening. The task seems impossible until a host of lowly ants come to her aid, placing each kind grain by grain in its own mound. Similarly, when a woman must make a crucial decision, she often must first sort out a jumble of conflicted feelings and competing loyalties. The situation is often especially confusing when Aphrodite has a hand in the situation. Sorting the seeds is then an inward task, requiring that a woman look honestly within, sift through her feelings, her values, motives, and separate what is truly important from what is insignificant. When a woman learns to stay with a confused situation and not act until clarity emerges, she has learned to trust the ants. These insects are analogous to an intuitive process, the workings of which are beyond conscious control. Or clarity can come through her conscious efforts to systematically or logically assess and assign priority to many elements involved in a decision. Okay, so task number 2 is acquiring some golden fleece. Aphrodite next orders Psyche to acquire some golden fleece from the terrible rams of the sun. They're huge, aggressive, horned beasts who are in a field butting against each other. If Psyche were to go among them and try to take their wool, she would surely be trampled or crushed. Once again, the task seems impossible until a green reed comes to her aid and advises her to wait until sundown, when the rams disperse and retire. Then she can safely pick strands of golden fleece off the brambles against which the rams had brushed. Symbolically, the golden fleece represents power, which a woman needs to acquire without being destroyed in the attempt to gain some. When an Aphrodite woman or a vulnerable goddess type goes out into the competitive world where others battle aggressively for power and position, she may be hurt or disillusioned if she does not recognize the dangers. She may be hardened and cynical. Her caring and trusting self may become a casualty, trampled underfoot. An armored Athena can be in the midst of a battlefield, directly involved in strategy and politics, but a woman who's like Psyche does better observing, waiting, and gradually acquiring power indirectly. Acquiring the golden fleece without destroying Psyche is a metaphor for the task of gaining power and remaining a compassionate person.
That is a fascinating thing you just read. This idea of both having a ton of power, or I would almost rather say it, empowerment, with full compassion, right? Because we sometimes see those things at odds with each other, where if I'm in a powerful place, I have to be a hard ass and I can't have any compassion for the people that I might be leading or power over or empowered by or with. And or if I'm fully compassionate, I'm completely vulnerable and I'll be a sitting duck, right? But I love that idea of weaving those two things in having the full expression of both of them simultaneously.
Right. This is especially important when you're learning to assert yourself. By focusing only on expressing your needs or anger, your conversations become alienating confrontations that don't help you achieve what you want and that present you in a harsh, destructive light. And that's what she mentions. All right. So task number 3, filling the crystal flask. For the third task, Aphrodite places a small crystal flask in Psyche's hand and tells her she must fill it with water from a forbidden stream. The stream cascades from a spring at the summit of the highest cliff to the lowest depth of the underworld, before being drawn up through the earth to emerge once more from the spring. Metaphorically, the stream represents the circular flow of life, into which Psyche must dip to fill her flask. As she gazes at the icy stream, which is etched deeply into a jagged cliff and guarded by dragons, the task of filling her flask seems impossible. This time, an eagle comes to her aid. The eagle symbolizes the ability to see the landscape from a distant perspective and swoop down to grasp what is needed. This is not the usual perceptive mode for a woman such as Psyche, who is so personally involved that she cannot see the forest for the trees. It is especially important for Aphrodite women to get some emotional distance on her relationships in order to see overall patterns and pick out important details that will enable her to grasp what is significant. Then she can assimilate experience and shape the form her life can take. So this is important for, as we mentioned, that sustainability aspect that Aphrodite has a tendency to not really be tapped into.
I think one of the reasons you spent more time on the Aphrodite goddess archetype in the way that, you know, Psyche was working through these different things and all the illustrations here is because, unlike the other archetypes, Aphrodite is probably one of the most misunderstood and the least common archetype that women are allowed to express. It's not that there's a limited quantity of Aphrodites in the world. It's just like I said earlier, it can be demonized or marginalized. So if you are listening and you have Aphrodite energy, it's probably the part of you that you get a lot of pushback against, right? A lot of these other archetypes are honored in one way or another. And then this Aphrodite is kind of sitting out here and it's almost like this part of you that may not be honored as much as the others, or it's pigeonholed into one expression of it. It's turned into the person that's using it into their own image in a way, right? And it's like they want to marginalize or push it away. And so I think it's interesting for someone that has a strong Aphrodite energy to hear this message you're talking about, because I think Aphrodite feminine archetypes struggle in a very unique way, not more than the other archetypes, but just in a unique way from the other archetypes, where there's not a lot of understanding or support. Because again, it's threatening to other, like, let's say you're a woman with Aphrodite energy, you're not going to find a lot of support from other women because your energy is threatening. So you're almost isolated and alone in this by yourself.
Yeah, I think that there is also, for women who need to develop more Aphrodite energy, is they're also afraid of that power in themselves because Aphrodite is very powerful. That's why she's threatening to others. And then those who are developing it or those who are natural Aphrodites can just be afraid of it. What will this mean? How much power will I have? Will it be humiliating? Like, there's a lot of questions around it. And so I agree. I think Aphrodite is in a unique situation. Most of the other goddesses have a place in the world that very much like favors them or rewards them or gives them a lot of positive feedback. Aphrodite gets a lot of positive feedback conceptually, but in practice can sometimes be a little scary. So yeah, I would agree. Okay, fourth and final task, learning to say no. For her fourth and final task, Aphrodite orders Psyche to descend into the underworld with a small box for Persephone to fill with beauty ointment. Psyche equates the task with death. Now it is a far-seeing tower's turn to give her advice. This task is more than the traditional hero's test of courage and determination, for Aphrodite has made it particularly difficult. Psyche is told that she will encounter pathetic people who will ask her for help, and 3 times she will have to harden her heart to compassion, ignore their pleas, and continue on. If she does not, she will stay forever in the underworld. To set a goal and keep it in the face of requests for help is especially difficult for all except virgin goddess women. Maternal Demeter women and obliging Persephone women are the most responsive to the needs of others, while Hera and Aphrodite women are somewhere in between. The task Psyche accomplishes when she says no 3 times is to exercise choice. Many women allow themselves to be imposed on and diverted from doing something for themselves. They cannot accomplish whatever they set out to do or what is best for them until they learn to say no. Whether it is a person who needs their company or comfort, or the attraction of an erotically charged relationship. Until a woman can say no to her particular susceptibility, she cannot determine her own life course. Through the 4 tasks, Psyche evolves. She develops capacities and strengths as her courage and determination are tested. Yet despite all she acquires, her basic nature and priorities remain unchanged. She values a love relationship, risks everything for it, and wins. I think the idea of learning those boundaries, we've already talked about it for the other archetypes, particularly the vulnerable archetypes, but being able to create those boundaries, but then also it's being able to say no, not necessarily saying no, but usually to build the skill of it, you have to do it some. And the hit you take for that, especially if you're a responsive archetype, is pretty painful. You think that, you think you have to say yes to everybody and be all things to everyone. And so being able to say no, I think, is really powerful.
Yeah. So Aphrodite is the alchemical goddess. And this is the third installment of the goddess archetypes. Last episode, we talked about the vulnerable goddesses, the goddesses that are in some ways defined by the relationships they have in their lives. And they're vulnerable because it's not just them and what their direction is. They're somewhat interdependent on the other energies and people around them. And then the first podcast that set all this up, we talked about the virgin goddesses who are very self-directed and focused and are more self-contained. They don't have a dependency or a consideration, let's say, of the relationship elements as they move through the world. And so these are 3 broad categories of virgin, vulnerable, and alchemical. And you can start to see those categories. And as you've been listening along in this series, if you have feminine energy or feminine archetype in your person coming out, you probably are identifying, again, with one or more of these as a strength. So you probably have 1 or 2 or 3 maybe that are really forceful and showing up in your life in a very prominent way. And then some of these others might be more shadow-like archetypes in you, something that you don't necessarily have very developed, or it's something that doesn't show up much. Maybe it's the time of your life right now. Maybe you're younger, so you don't have a lot of Demeter, but maybe later in life when you become a mother or you go into a more nurturing role, if you're not a female, that might bring out the Demeter energy in you. So these energies are at play. You can see these, again, this is just a model, just a map. It's not the territory. This doesn't actually explain an actual person, but just gives us another model or map to see how people show up and understanding the interplay between all these energies and how anybody that might be overvaluing one or more of these energies and have a loud voice might be trying to speak for everybody that has other energies, and there might be conflict. There's might be a war between certain energies. Maybe there's a little bit of a battle or a little bit of a tension point, anywhere from just tension to a full-out war based on are overvaluing our experiences as people and who has the loudest megaphone in the moment, right? There's probably different time periods of history where certain elements of these archetypes were also honored and respected or propped up more. And then other times when they've been demonized or suppressed. So we have to take into account where we are culturally in the time period of history, where we all are as people technologically and in how we see ourselves in the world and the dynamics between people, and then where we are individually and how you're wired and your energies as a person show up for you. So there's like a lot of different things and a lot of factors at play. And I would say that a lot of people probably have a lot of natural wiring, but they might get cultural messages. You have to be this one type of archetype, or these couple types are appropriate or acceptable. If you don't fit those, you're not a good person. You know, there's some messages there too. So hopefully if you're in that category where you feel maybe pushed away because you don't have the right energy, quote unquote, you feel a little bit more emboldened by this podcast series where you can say, well, I have this energy over here that isn't honored by society, but I feel it strongly. So does that make me bad or wrong? No, it doesn't. You just have a different energy than other people that have these showing up for them.
Yeah. The purpose of these podcasts is to send an empowering message that all of us are wired or nurtured into certain styles of thinking, and we gravitate towards certain archetypes. And none of them are better or worse than any of the others, but some of them can provide some balance for us if we need to head one direction or another. And as you mentioned, Joel, if we are an archetype that maybe is in a time period or a place in the world, a time period in history or a place in the world that is marginalized or devalued, well, it's not inherently devalued. It's just sometimes we have bad luck where we show up. And also that doesn't mean that you can't develop the good aspects of that archetype while balancing them out with other aspects. And as you start to look at other examples of this, we've mentioned examples of different people who might be embodying some of these archetypes. Nobody's ever one single thing. I've always noticed that it's like multiple things. Like Joel just mentioned, Inara from Firefly is probably an Aphrodite, but I think Inara has a lot of Hestia in her too. So she would be an interesting amalgamation of Hestia and Aphrodite. That's a fascinating combination. We mentioned before Claire from House of Cards is probably an Athena, but she has some pretty strong Hera in her too. So she's a very fascinating amalgamation of those two things. And you'll start to see that. You'll start to see how nobody's just one thing. And so balancing ourselves out by developing more of the strengths of those archetypes that we have a tendency, to trend toward. And then also figuring out, maybe I got to develop a little bit more of this thing over here. Maybe in my life, this is a time period where I'm ready for that. So we hope that you use these archetypes in an empowered way, that they help you understand a little bit more about yourself and other people. And we'd also love to hear what you think.
Yeah, you asked me in the first podcast what you thought my anima was, and I'm still thinking about this. I know that if you've been listening along, you're probably like, what is Joel going to say about that? Because he promised he'd tell me in a later podcast, and I actually don't. I have no idea. I'm still thinking through it and trying to figure that piece out because I don't know what the anima in me is. And when we get to the next part of the series, the gods in every man, when we talking about the masculine archetypes, we'll probably visit to what you would see as your animus, Antonia. And I don't know what that would be, but I think we can play with those, and maybe by the end of that series we'll find it, or maybe sometime in the near future we'll talk about it. I have no idea, but I just wanted to mention that if you've been waiting with bated breath for me to say something.
Yeah, I know my animus.
Well, there you go. You're more organized than I am, I guess, with what your animus is.
Yeah, I know which primary masculine archetype is my primary animus. But I mean, obviously, I'm going to have a little bit of all of them. But I know which one I identify with the strongest. Sure. I thought you said that you were suspecting yours was Aphrodite, your animus.
That's what I said in the first podcast, but I don't know. I don't know. It's something that's so it's hard to grasp because it's not a primary thing in my life. It's something that's it's a quiet energy, obviously, because it's my anima, right? So I don't know that for sure, but I'll keep thinking about it and pondering as I go through time.
I know you're not going to like this, but what if it's Queen of the Underworld?
No, interesting.
Yeah, because you're into all sorts of stuff.
Yeah?
Yeah, like chaos magic and you go to the darker places of the psyche.
I just thought that was my authenticity process. I loved graveyards as a teenager and all the dark poetry and Edgar Allan Poe stuff. So I just figured that was my introverted feeling authenticity. But I guess it could be a Queen of the Underworld kind of framework too.
I don't know.
All right, well, I'll have to play with that.
You'll start with it.
I'll see what happens.
Maybe by the next podcast you'll have ruminated on it and we'll know what your goddess anima is.
Maybe. Anyway, long story short, if you enjoyed this podcast and you would like to make your story heard and give your opinion, your thoughts, share your story, ask a question, give your perspective, maybe one of these archetypes that's showing up for you. If you feel very heavily in the feminine energy space, whether you're a man or a woman, and you'd like to come over to personalityhacker.com, you can make your voice heard directly below this podcast. We'd love to hear from you. You can also join our community of like minds over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack. We're also on Instagram and other social media platforms like YouTube and LinkedIn. You can find us on all those different places. So come, whatever your platform of choice is, come join us. And I'm sure in the future, they'll continue inventing endless social media platforms. So by the time you hear this several years from now, those all might be outdated and there might be new ones, and we'll be on those too. So find us wherever you need to find us. Long story short.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you want to know how to support Personality Hacker, one of the best ways to do so is to invest in yourself with a premium program. So go to personalityhacker.com and find out if in our catalog of programs something stands out to you as interesting and will move the needle for your personal growth and development. And I haven't said it in a while, but remember, your rating and review on iTunes helps us out a lot.
Yeah, we're going to move on to Gods in Every Man in another short little series. So stay tuned for that, and we will talk to you. Well, my name is Joel Mark Witt, I should say that.
And I should probably say that I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.